So, Overwatch. Blizzard's new team-based cartoony shooter. If you've ever played Team Fortress 2, you might obviously want to know how closely Overwatch compares. And that's pretty natural. This video overview that I made from my closed beta experiences is here to help you decide if Overwatch could be worth your time if you're already a TF2 player. Now, when I say TF2 player, you could be anyone who's played it a handful of times, was forced to play it because all your friends were doing it, still play it today, or played it a lot during its heyday and then left it for other games. Like me! At initial glance, the similarities are there. You've got control point games and payload games, though in the case of Overwatch, there are combinations. In the original TF2 maps, you didn't generally have a mix of payload and control point, but Overwatch likes to mix and match these. There are several straightforward control point maps, but they also tossed a control point or two in several of their payload maps, usually where the attacking team has to capture an initial control point to trigger the payload portion of the map. There are several King of the Hill type maps, but in general can feel a little lopsided to play, at least to me, and weren't as interesting as their CP payload maps. There's no free-for-all, and there's no team deathmatch though. If those are two modes that are a must-have for you, you're gonna be disappointed. There's also no real scoreboard, and the kill feed that tells you who's killing who in real time is off by default. According to GameSpot's recent multi-part documentary on Overwatch, these were all choices they made on purpose because Overwatch places a heavier emphasis on teamwork than anything else. They don't want kill-death ratios because they don't want players valuing kills over other team behavior. And they're not wrong. TF2 players are often vocal about how good they think they are and how hard they're owning somebody. There's always someone bragging about carrying the team or bemoaning the team if they lose, like somehow it's not their fault at all. Lots of TF2 players love to bitch. I mean, sometimes myself included. And if they deny that, then they're just fucking liars. There's certainly that toxic aspect that's always been present when you have a game with people competing for kills. The Nemesis revenge system in TF2 encourages that kind of behavior even further because players will often get tunnel vision trying to get revenge on a kill. But Overwatch has no such Nemesis system in place, so you'll never be constantly reminded that a particular person is wrecking your face unless you're the one keeping count. If you're dying a lot in Overwatch, but you're helping your team by doing so, then you're actually doing it right, because the name of the game is objectives in Overwatch, not the kills, and you will get points in various categories at the end of each round that often have nothing to do with kills at all. And this is the part where I want to be honest with the rest of you TF2 players out there who are mad at Overwatch without playing it first. Yes, you know who you are. Okay, this is difficult to say, but there's a hard truth we have to admit to ourselves. There's generally two pools of TF2 players out there. The group that was prevalent before and just slightly after it went free to play, but before it became Hat Fortress 2. And the group of TF2 players who are current players, who are the ones hating on Overwatch because frankly, they feel threatened by it. I fall into the previous group. I still play TF2 on occasion, but let's be honest, it's not really the same game that it was back then. Nowadays, the servers I used to frequent are more sparse, the crowd seems to be full of obnoxious young kids with mics, at least during the day, and the last several times I played, the emphasis on teamwork was practically non-existent. It's still an incredibly fun game for all the chaos that can occur and all the wacky hijinks that ensue, but it's definitely lost that more focused edge that I remember from a long time ago. Now of course, your mileage may vary, and perhaps you're still on servers that still have that teamwork mentality in play. But I've just noticed, compared to when the game was newer and fresher, I don't notice it as often anymore. And this is why I think the TF2 players ragging on Overwatch are doing it for a lot of misguided reasons. Overwatch's approach to gameplay is just plain different than TF2. Now, this is something that's difficult to describe. You won't believe me until you actually play it for yourself, because it really, there's just really something you have to experience firsthand to understand how different it is. At its core, I feel that TF2 is much more, like pure skill-based. And although, it's got team in the title and as classes, it's always been a bit more forgiving if not everyone in the team chooses to actually play as a team. Usually as long as you have a medic here and there and you have a couple appropriate classes, about almost half the team can kind of decide to do their own thing and you'll still get by. Even though TF2 has different classes, it's still a game where teammates could choose to lone wolf it and sometimes still come out ahead. And at the end of every round, you know people are waiting to see if they've made the top 3 MVP spots and points. Overwatch doesn't like this route, however, and a lot of the design choices for classes are geared towards more team-oriented decisions and objectives. Lone wolfing it won't often get you very far in Overwatch. You can either choose a class that helps your team, or you're potentially handicapping them. It's generally not as easy for a single person to carry the way that maybe you could in TF2. Where TF2 has a certain skill requirement, Overwatch is a lot more forgiving in terms of player skill levels, and it frankly feels a lot easier to play, at least for me. It heavily encourages experimenting with different classes and swapping classes potentially several times during a single match, whereas in TF2 you'll be lucky if some people try 2 or more classes during the whole damn thing. I'm looking at you 3 spies on one team. Now in terms of map design, they've done a good job with Overwatch in designing maps that feel like they have several heights of gameplay, from the ground level to, mid area like balconies to skyfighting, though maybe not as multi-storied as some of TF2's later payload maps. If we're comparing these maps to older TF2 maps, it's tough, because TF2's original maps were very solid and well designed and had a simplicity that did a really good job of taking into account player flow, bottlenecking, that kind of thing, like pathing. Overwatch maps feel a little bit larger, generally speaking, by default, and there are definitely several sections that heavily favor snipers, so that can be a little frustrating if you're not one, but they still provide ample play area varieties for, different play styles. For example, as a McCree player who likes to stalk around like a spy, I can appreciate the corners and crannies in some of the maps that help me get into players' blind spots. Sure, there's the complaint that there's not a ton of maps, but I played Dust Bowl and Gold Rush almost exclusively for years, so I'm maybe not the best person to ask about that part. One thing I was a little bothered by, however, was something I took for granted from Valve, and it maybe is kind of more of a remnant of an older era of first-person shooters, but what I'm talking about is the player control of servers and customization options. In TF2, you can have your own servers, your own maps, your own sprays, avatars, the works. But this is Blizzard, and as such, all of that is unfortunately clamped down. Can't pick your own server, can't make your own server, can't upload your own sprays or player icons. Now they have a decent selection of sprays to choose from, but they're linked to specific characters. So for example, you can't do a chibi McCree spray on a wall while you're playing as Reinhardt. But they have some generic sprays that every class can use, but they're not that interesting to me. Sprays, player icons, character outfits, all of that is tied to their in-game loot box or currency system, where you either pay a set amount of the accumulated credits to get what you want, or you open a random loot box every time you level up and cross your fingers that you get a rare item in there. Some people like random crate stuff in games, but I personally am not a big fan since there's always specific things I want, and I'm usually unlucky and I never get them in my drops. I will say one element in this customized mix that I do like a lot are the highlight intros. These are animations that play at the start of your character's highlight reel or your play of the game montage. They're selectable, you can buy them, and they're really dynamic and cool, and they're super flashy and just kind of overall fun to watch. It makes me wish that TF2 had something similar to that, kind of to showcase little actions from the team characters. Speaking of play of the game, the downside with it is that 90% of the time the game picks moments that don't seem that important. There were several times I got 3 or 4 kills in a row, something really awesome happened, and then the play of the game was someone killing 2 people with a big pause in between. So I'm not sure how the game determines these moments, but it definitely needs work because it very rarely is a moment that's badass, and I'm sure being badass is probably the point of it. Now, unless you have a bunch of Battle.net friends, you probably won't be making any custom games, and you're going to experience the annoyance I did. Solo queue players only really have the play option, which will randomly toss you into any CP, payload, King of the Hill map without your control. So this goes back to me missing the choose your own map server option from TF2. Custom games is the workaround for this, but it requires people. I didn't try out the competitive gaming portion, but presumably you don't control that either. So basically, if you're on your own, you're at the whim of the game to decide what maps you'll play. Sometimes that's fun if you want the variety, but sometimes if I just want a control point map, for example, I'm kind of shit out of luck. Much like TF2, Overwatch definitely has its own style of music. Now, in Overwatch's case, it's really superhero-y sounding, almost kind of like something from the Avengers, or actually a specific track from Guardians of the Galaxy called Black Tears, if you've heard that one. But the Overwatch theme's pretty suitably epic, and it's in your face for sure, especially during the play of the game.
It's Halloween.
even if the theme can get a bit repetitive after a while, it's still pretty cool. Oh, and as an aside, there's no fall damage, so that's a thing. In TF2, getting fall damage made people a bit more selective on jumping in from long distances, but in Overwatch you can fall from any height without any consequences, and it's more of a strategic element to do like a big fall to get the drop on a group as well. The character design is also probably a love it or hate it for a lot of people. One of TF2's many design strengths is that all the characters are deceptively well designed. They're simple, but they look distinct where it counts, and most importantly, they have enough stylistic similarities to look like they all belong in the same world. Overwatch, on the other hand, while the designs are really well made and they look great, they all look really different from each other, almost to the point that when I look at the full lineup of the characters, it like immediately reminded me of Marvel vs. Capcom, or one of those mashup kind of games and series where the characters are from completely different worlds and forced together. That's probably the intent, and it's also, you know, it's a more fantastical comic bookish environment, but on some level the designs don't share the same sort of similarity that TF2's classes do. But they do follow the same silhouette trick that TF2 does, where every character has a unique silhouette that helps them stand out and be easily recognizable from any distance. So they did a good job designing in that regard. But let's get down to the part that everyone who's ever touched TF2 wants to know about: the characters. There's no getting around it. It's a toony shooter that's team-based and has characters spouting off one-liners, and there's big explosions everywhere. Now, that does sound a lot like TF2 to a lot of people, and I can't fault them for that. And there are also characters that a TF2 player might gravitate to due to their similarities. The upside, though, is that Overwatch has a lot of characters, a lot more than TF2, so there's a decent chance that you'll find a character that you really like. But the downside is also that Overwatch has a lot more characters than TF2. Despite people's opinions of balancing with newer weapons and gears a few years after TF2 has come out, most people generally seem to agree that at its height it was a very balanced game in terms of its classes. You really had clear foils to each class, you had strengths and weaknesses, and they all kind of complemented each other when used together. It's a little less clear in Overwatch. In my opinion, some characters are just all around better in a lot of cases than others, but of course this will vary from person to person. Like myself, for example, if I'm playing a tank, I tend to gravitate towards Reinhardt for his pure survivability and decent striking power, not to mention he has much better ability to protect teammates compared to the other tanks. Now, Zarya is eluding me right now, and she feels kind of weaker, but other people seem to have success with her. And I think that stems from the fact that some tanks actually are better suited to be off tanks and support rather than lead the charge. And this is actually something that's different from your standard TF2 lineup, where you just have, you know, like the heavy and that's kind of it. So you get more variety with a lot of characters that can sort of wear multiple hats depending on the situation. Also, some characters are far more map dependent or dependent on the current group dynamic. In many King of the Hill maps, for example, Lucio seems preferred to Mercy for his speed boost getting to the point, and then the general kind of decent AoE heals he can provide once you're on the point. Zenyatta seems a little less effective relative to the other healers. He has a focused heal and he also has an enemy debuff, but he doesn't have any assisted movement speed like Mercy and Lucio has, and then he doesn't have any backup kind of DPS the way that Symmetra's turrets have. The game itself likes to try and gently enforce team rules, like suggesting when your team makeup sucks, and then what it thinks is a better combination for attack or defense. There's usually little pop-up messages saying, not enough offense, or need a builder, or no tank, that sort of thing. Relapse to your old TF2 days where no one wants to play medic and your team's doomed to fail if that last slot doesn't go to a healer on your team. But for the most part, at least during the beta, a lot of people seemed pretty good about eventually filling those slots with the appropriate class type to make the best team dynamic possible. It remains to be seen if people will be trolls during the final release of the game and just choose to be whatever character they want regardless of what's good for the team or not. Now, if you were a soldier in TF2, Pharah's probably going to be the obvious place for you to start because she's got rockets, although you won't be doing any rocket jumping because she can fly. And if you were Demo Man, you can start with Junkrat, though there's definitely some adjustment as he's a lot more chaotic and he's got a little bit less tactical capability than the Demo Man, since you're essentially losing a full round of stickies and instead gaining a single explosive detonating trap, which he could still use to sticky jump to higher places. Scout players presumably get a pretty big boost switching to Tracer, as in my opinion, she's pretty damn annoying, and she's pretty deadly too. Medic players have a pretty easy transition to Mercy, if that's what they want to do, because she's got some pretty blatantly similar healing and damage boosting moves compared to the medic. But engineers might be a little less enthused with Torbjorn, depending on the NG's playstyle. He's got a pretty good powerhouse of an ultimate, but his regular turret is a little less powerful than, say, a level 3 sentry, and it doesn't have any Wrangler option if you were one of those NGs that likes using a Wrangler. Now, if you did like using a Wrangler in TF2, it's probably actually better for you to play as Bastion and essentially be your own turret, where you can turn yourself wherever you want to go. There's also no dispenser, but Torbjorn can drop armor for people to grab, so it helps a little bit, and he doesn't have a teleport, because the ability to create a teleport was actually given to Symmetra for her ultimate. If you like Sniper, you'll pretty much get two flavors in Hanzo and Widowmaker. Widowmaker's basically, default Sniper, and Hanzo's kind of like a Sniper with a Huntsman. But there are also TF2 classes completely absent, and this is the part that will probably lead TF2 players to feel that Overwatch is not complete in being a TF2 clone, because there's no Pyro class, and there's no Spy class. Now, Mei can be vaguely argued as the closest thing to a Pyro in this game, because she's got a freeze cannon that you can hold down and slowly freeze a target. Bonus is that if you freeze them long enough, they'll actually be frozen solid for a second or two and stunned and can be picked off either by Mei or a teammate. But it takes a decent chunk of time to fully freeze somebody. And even though the freeze cannon does a small amount of continuous damage, it's nowhere near Pyro's lethally effective burning damage. Though both function well as team harassers, Mei's forced to be a bit more tactical as a player than Pyro. And the Spy. It's the trickiest class. To TF2's credit, their balance takes spies into account really well. It's just as important a class as any of the other ones. But in Overwatch, I can't tell if Blizzard tried to implement one and couldn't, or if they didn't want to deal with the hassle of it in the first place. A spy is deceptively very difficult to balance well with other classes. Maybe having a character that could disguise as anyone might change up the dynamic too much, like it might have people playing defensively far too often. The other issue that makes this difficult is the fact that there is unlimited ammo in Overwatch. Unlike TF2, where you have to consider your ammo supply every time you attack, Overwatch is full of spray and pray and spammers. Because why would you be worried about conserving ammo if you never run out? A spy in this environment might end up being far too hard to play, because the easiest thing for everyone to do would be to, annoyingly, spam every corner and every perceived friendly they see, since there's no friendly fire and the traditional way of testing your friend is to see if they take damage the way a spy would. It's too bad too, because many of the maps have some really nice spy-friendly corners that would be pretty cool to hide in or to get into people's blind spots. The biggest hurdle to get over if you're a TF2 player is the class dynamics. If you can acclimate to these different characters and recognize that they're simply not the TF2 classes, then you'll probably get around to really enjoying Overwatch. They're making high-quality character cinematics and comics, so it's not unlike Valve's approach to TF2, but to be fair, Valve's not the only company that's done that with their games, so it's an easy comparison to make, because it really does look the same, but it's maybe not the most fair comparison. And I am not even going to touch the whole free-to-play versus $40 game nonsense. Yeah, TF2's free now, but Overwatch is just $40, and it's cheaper than most games, and half of you TF2 players spend more on fucking hats and taunts than that. So, should Overwatch be considered a TF2 clone? Nah, not really. It took me a while to sit down and realize that other games have these game modes and team compositions and elements and all that stuff. It's not like it's the first time we're seeing this. But it's the stylized, toony look that I think is the number one thing continually linking these two together. That toony look will get you every time. But Overwatch heavily stresses teamwork and coordinated efforts far more than TF2 ever has. When you steamroll through the opposing team by synergizing your abilities together, it feels pretty damn awesome. Bottom line, if you want a fun, chaotic game with very loose team dynamics where you can still run amok and do your own thing, TF2 will always reign supreme. But if you want a more structured bit of fun where the name of the game really is the effort on working together as a team and doing your own role effectively for the team as a whole, then Overwatch might be for you. I think once Overwatch is out and they start adding to their IP and helping it grow, it'll hopefully help distance itself from the shadow of TF2. And maybe TF2 players will realize that Overwatch isn't a threat and that both games are different on their own merits and can coexist. Because despite my TF2 loyal fiancé insisting that Overwatch sucks, even though he's never tried it, I think it still deserves a shot. But it doesn't have any hats.